In this video, we're going to look at two different ways that we can use Alpine. Firstly, we're going to look at how we can enhance our applications with interactive functionality using small pieces of state on the front end. And you can see an example of this on the Alpine documentation, for example here. This uses a single piece of state, the open variable, which is true or false. And when we click a button, we can change the state of that variable from true to false, or vice versa from false to true. And depending on the value of that variable, we show a span containing some content. So in this case, we're using Alpine to lightly enhance the front end. But what we can also do is we can use Alpine in a more similar way to the likes of React.js. We can serialize entire model instances or lists of models, and then we can work with those directly in our Alpine components. We're going to see examples of both of these approaches in this video, so let's get started. Now I have a project in VS Code. This contains a single view that loads a template called index.html, and let's go to that template just now and we'll see what's in there. Basically nothing. We're going to write Alpine code in this template throughout the video. Now to work with some application data, I'm going to go to modals.py and we're going to create a database model in this application, and we'll call this model team, and it will inherit from Django's model class. The team is going to have two fields, and one of them is going to be a modals.car field for the team's name, and we'll give that a max length of 100. And we're also going to have the team's city, in other words where this team is from, also going to be a car field, and again we'll give it max length of 100 characters. Finally, we'll add a _string method returning the team's name. Let's now run python manage.py make migrations, and that's going to create the migration file, and then we can run the migrate command, and this command will then create the database in our project. Now that we have the database, I'm going to create a super user, and then I'm going to add some data to this application. So let's run the create super user management command. We'll give the user a name of admin, and you can give that user any password you like. Once that's done, we can then run the server, and we'll then go to the admin interface and create some teams. But before we do that, we also need to add the team to the admin.py file. So at the top of this file, let's import the team model and let's register that team here. When we call admin.site.register and pass a model to that, it makes it available in the admin UI. We can now go to the browser. This is our default template that just says hello. We're going to change that soon, but for now, let's go to the admin UI. And we'll log in with the super user that we just created. Let's go to the teams page here, and we're going to add some teams to this database. So I've now added these 8 teams to the database. These are football teams, but you can add teams of any kind you want. Let's now go back to Django's views.py file, and we're going to add all of these teams to our context. So in this dictionary here, let's define a key called teams, and that's going to load team.objects.all. In other words, every single team we have in the table. And at the top here, don't forget to import the team model. What we're going to do now is we're going to go to our index.html template, and we're going to display these teams within a table. To do that, I'm going to go to the Bootstrap documentation here, and we're going to copy the HTML structure for this table here. We can copy that and amend the headers here to show the headers that we have in our model, which you can see here. We have a name and a city. So what we'll do is go to index.html, and I'm going to paste code in here for this. So we have a table HTML element with the class of table, which comes from Bootstrap. We then have within our table head 2 columns here, one for the name and one for the city for the team. Within our table body here, we define a template for loop, looping over the teams that we've just added to the context, and we render those out in table data elements. So for each team in the database, we have a row in the table, and we list out the name and the city for that team. Let's save that file and go back to our page here, and we're going to go to the home page of this application, and we can now see that there's a table containing the teams that we have in our database. Let's get to the crux of this video, and that's using Alpine.js to add some light interactive functionality to an application. And it's very easy to do this with Alpine, and it has the benefit that you don't need to serialize any complex data structures from your backend to your Alpine components. We're simply going to use small pieces of state to control certain aspects of the DOM. So let's imagine that a requirement for this page is that we need to be able to toggle the visibility of this table. We're going to use Alpine now, and we're going to define a component in this HTML template. But firstly, of course, we need to add Alpine to this project. Let's go back to the browser and we'll go to the Alpine documentation here. On the left hand side, there's an installation section, and we can copy the script tag that's defined down here, and we can paste that into the template that we're working with. In my case, I'm extending a base template, so I'm going to go there and within the head tag I'm just going to paste that script. So that brings Alpine into our project. Then in the index.html file, on this root div here, I'm going to define an Alpine component, and we can do that with the xData directive. So the goal here is to show this table that we have on the front end conditionally based on whether a piece of state is true or false. So let's go back to the template, and we're going to set in the xData a JavaScript object here, and it's going to have one piece of state called show, which is going to be set initially to false. Now we need a way to actually change the state from false to true and vice versa. So we're going to define above the table a button here, and we'll give that button some bootstrap classes, button and button-primary, and let's also give it some margin bottom here, MB4, and the text within the button should say toggle table. Now what we want to do when we click this button, we want to change the state of show from false to true, or if show is already true, we want to change it back to false. So we're simply toggling the value of this show element. So let's add an Alpine click handler to this button, and we can do that with that syntax there. And within the string, we're going to invert the value of the show state to whatever it is not currently at the moment. So for example, if it's true, we're going to change that to false and vice versa. And finally, to the table itself, we can add an xShow directive, and we're only going to show this table if this piece of state called show is set to true. So we'll use that value here within this directive. Let's save this and go back to our page here. As you can see, the table is now hidden because at the beginning, when this is first loaded, this piece of state is set to false, therefore the xShow does not actually show the table. When we click the button, it's going to change that to true, and therefore the table should be shown on the page. Let's see if that works by clicking this button, and you can see that we're now able to toggle this table. So we have this nice, very simple interactive functionality on our page, and in order to do this, we simply define very simple state in our xData, and we can use that to conditionally show and change things on our DOM. Now for me, this is one of the best ways to use Alpine. It's very simple to do. We just define very lightweight bits of state, and that can open doors for all sorts of things in your front end. As another example, imagine that this button was submitting data as an AJAX request to a server. We can use Alpine state to show a spinner within this button while the request is in flight, and then when the response is received, we can change some state and then hide the spinner again. So it's very easy to do these things with Alpine.js, and you can add these little touches all over your site, for example in modals, tabs, alerts, cards, and other UI components. So that's the first way to use Alpine, where you use very simple state, and you can therefore build simple interactive features on your site. This is my favorite way of using Alpine, but you can also use it to serialize things to JSON, and then use Alpine in a way that's more similar to, for example, Vue.js. Now to do that, we need to convert data on our backend to JSON. Within the Alpine state, you'll convert that JSON data to JavaScript objects, and then you can manage the entire data on your client using Alpine.js. And this is beneficial in some circumstances. You can do things on the client side that don't require you to send requests to the server, so that can result in less load on servers and databases. The downside is, of course, that you have to work with JSON data, and this will increase the complexity of your application. For example, we have a Django model here. If we want to serialize that to JSON, that's additional complexity in our application. When we change the model, we may need to change the serializers and other components. So this approach does have some downsides, and it brings Alpine a little bit closer to React or Vue.js. However, one thing to say about this is you can do these JSON-based tasks, but you don't need to rewire your whole Django application. Things like authentication will still work, and you get all the benefits of Django, but with some additional client-side functionality wherever you need it. Let's see an example of using Alpine this way now. What we're going to do is serialize all our teams in the database to JSON data, and we're going to pass that to an Alpine component, and Alpine will then control that data on our client side. In order to do this, I'm going to stop the server and we're going to install Django REST Framework. We can do that with the pip install Django REST Framework command, and that will install that into our virtual environment. And if you're not familiar with Django REST Framework, let's go to the page here. It's a very powerful library for building APIs on Django. So we have this installed. We're now going to create a new file within our core application, and that's going to be called serializers.py. And what we're going to do is create a class that's going to serialize our team instances to JSON data. So at the top, let's bring in a couple of imports. From REST framework.serializers, we'll import the model serializer, and under that we'll create a class called 𝗵_serializer, and this will inherit from the modal serializer that we've imported at the top. Now modal serializers in Django REST framework, they're very similar to modal forms. We simply define a meta class and we link it to a particular model, in this case the 𝗵 model. Under that we can define which fields on the model that we want to serialize to JSON. So we want to serialize the name field, and we also want to serialize the city to JSON as well. Let's now go back to our views.py file. At the top we're going to import from the serializers module this new serializer that we've created, and at the top we'll also import the JSON module from Python. Now what we want to do is we want to take this query set of 𝗵 objects and we want to convert it to JSON. So let's pull the 𝗵s into a variable here, 𝗵.objects.all. We can then pass these 𝗵s to our serializer like this, and we also need to specify the many equals true flag. Whenever we're serializing more than one object, for example a query set of objects, we need to pass many equals true as a keyword argument. What this will give us back is a dictionary where the model instances have been converted to normal Python dictionaries, and we can print that to our terminal below. And finally we're going to serialize the dictionary to JSON. We can do this using the JSON module's dumps function. So here in the 𝗵s context we're going to reference json.dumps and we'll pass the 𝗵s dictionary to that. And there's one mistake in this code. This gives us back a serializer instance. To get the dictionaries of data, we need to call the .data attribute on that. So after we've instantiated the 𝗵 serializer with our 𝗵s query set, we can then get the list of dictionaries using the .data attribute. And we're going to see what that looks like on the terminal now. Let's run the Django development server and we're going to go back to our page. When we refresh this page, we are not going to get a result that's valid because we're changing the structure of the way this is done. If we go to the terminal that's running on VS Code, you can see the output of the 𝗵s dictionary. We have a list with each element within the list being an ordered dictionary that contains the 𝗵s name and the city. And I'm going to change the name of this variable from 𝗵s dictionary to 𝗵s list, and that's because the wrapper is actually a list. And let's also get rid of this print statement. So let's go over this process so that we know what's going on here. We have a query set of our 𝗵s in the database here on line 8. On line 9 we pass the query set to our serializer object. That will then convert the query set of 𝗵s to a list of objects, native Python objects. Finally, we take the list of dictionaries and we convert it to JSON data. So now the 𝗵s value in our context is set to some JSON data. We can then reference that directly in our Alpine component. So let's go to the index.html and we're going to add a new piece of state in the X data, and that's going to have a key of 𝗵s, and we're going to set that equal to what's in our context for 𝗵s. Remember, in our view we're adding JSON data here. We can then reference that here in our Alpine component and set the X data appropriately. If we save that and go back to our page and reload, let's inspect the HTML that we have on this page, and we can see here that the div on this page, it has the Alpine X data directive, and you can see that the 𝗵s variable in that state is set to these objects. So these objects are now available directly in our Alpine component. What we can do in order to show the table is we can loop over them and show them within that table using an X for directive. So let's go back to the template and let's scroll down here to this for loop. We're going to remove the Django for loop. Because this data is now in Alpine, we can use a template X for loop here, and don't forget to remove the end for and close off that template tag. So we now have an Alpine X for directive, and we're looping over the 𝗵s that we've serialized to JSON and that are now stored in our Alpine component. And for each 𝗵, we want to render the 𝗵s name and the city. Now to do this with Alpine, we need to remove these Django variables here. And to the TD element, we're going to add an X text directive, and we're going to set that equal to the 𝗵.name. And we're going to do the same for the other table data element. And instead of 𝗵.name, here it's going to be 𝗵.city. Let's now show this in the browser. When we hit the toggle table button, we're now getting this working again, and that's because we've serialized everything to JSON. We're storing that JSON here within our Alpine component, and then we use the template for loop to loop over that data and display it on the table. And all the code that we wrote above for showing the table and toggling that with this button, that still is working on the front end. As you can see here, we're still able to toggle the visibility of that table. Now later on we're going to see the benefits of having this state directly on our client. For now, let's see a second way of doing this. We can also use the JSON script template filter in Django, and I've just done a video on this topic if you want to check that out. What this does is it takes Python objects and it serializes them to JSON in a script tag. We're going to use this to remove this step in our view where we explicitly use JSON from the Python standard library to dump that data to JSON. We can remove that particular function and simply refer to the teams list that's generated when we instantiate the team serializer with our query set and get the data from that. Remember this line of code here, it takes our query set of team objects and it converts that to a list of Python dictionaries with one dictionary for each object in the query set. Now lists and dictionaries are native to Python and we can use the JSON script template filter in order to dump those to a script tag. So we have this teams list in our context. Let's go back to index.html. At the bottom of the template we're going to reference this teams list and then we can apply the JSON script template tag to that and we can give it an ID here. And I'm going to give that an ID of teams-JSON here. And this should actually be teams because that's the name of the key in our context as you can see here. So make sure that we reference the name of the key within the context here in the template. So let's now save this file. If we refresh this page and inspect the elements on the page, you can see at the bottom of the div containing our Alpine component, we now have a script tag. If we expand that, we see that we have the data and it's been serialized to JSON. This is now within an application JSON script. So what we're going to do is we're going to reference this script and it has the ID that we gave it in the template. And we're going to use that to correctly set the teams within the X data. Currently it's set to this object coming back from Python. This is not going to work in JavaScript or Alpine.js. Because these ordered dictionaries, JavaScript has no idea what that is. Therefore, when we go to our page and try and toggle the table, nothing is going to happen because this page is broken, as you can see in the console here. So let's go back to our template and instead of directly referencing the list of dictionaries, instead we're going to write some JavaScript here and it's going to be document.getElementById and we're going to find the element with the ID of teams-JSON. And that particular element with that ID, it refers to this script tag here containing our JSON data. So that will give us the tag. We can get the content using the .textContent field. So let's add that here, .textContent. And the final thing we need to do to convert that into a JavaScript object that we can use here in the component is we can use the JSON.parse function that will convert the JSON data to a JavaScript object. So that's our X data and we can format that so that it appears a little bit nicer here. If we save that and refresh this page, when we hit the toggle table button, we now see that we have the elements coming back. So this is an alternative way to do that. We don't need to serialize everything in the view here using the JSON.dumps function. Instead, we simply call the serializer and then in the template we can use this JSON script filter here to convert that data to JSON within a script tag and then reference that using the JSON.parse function and the document.getElementById function. So that's two ways that we can take a query set of Django objects and serialize these to JSON data that we can then use within an Alpine component. Now of course there's another way we can do that. We can directly write Django REST Framework API views and then call these within an 𝗤init directive. The downside of this is that we need to actually write extra views in our application and there are extra network requests in order to do that. We're not going to cover that technique in this video. It's a perfectly valid way to do things where you write your views using Django REST Framework and that returns the data as a separate network request. Now let's demonstrate some benefits of having all your data available on the client within your Alpine component. Now the benefit of having this data on the client is that you could do things such as filtering this table without hitting your server. So for example, if we wanted to get all the teams from a particular city, we could do that work on the client and that's because all the data is already stored on the client within the xData directive. We're going to finish this video with some examples of how we can use the data that's available within this teams variable in order to do some things with our user interface such as highlighting elements. So what I'm going to do in our xData, I'm going to add another key here called highlighted and that's going to be an empty array in JavaScript. And the idea is that when we click a particular row in this table, it's going to append that row to the highlighted array. Now let's go back to our template here and when this row is clicked representing one of the teams that we've got on our front end, we want to add the team name to that highlighted list. So let's add a click event here and this is an Alpine click event so it uses this syntax here. And we have an array in our state called highlighted Let's copy that, and in this click event what we're going to do is we're going to push a new element to that highlighted list. And in JavaScript you can add an element to an array with the push method. And let's just add the team.name. So we're storing the names of teams that have been clicked within this highlighted array. Once we've done that, we can then use this highlighted array in order to highlight teams that are in that array with a different background color. So to the table data element containing the name of the team, we're going to bind the class attribute, and we're going to say if the highlighted array includes the team's name, and we can use the array.includes function for that. And we pass the team's name here to check whether or not that's in the array. If the team is in that array, that will evaluate to true, and we can use the AND operator in JavaScript to attach a class for the background color. In this case, we'll use background primary in Bootstrap. Let's now save this file and go back to the page and check whether this works. If we refresh the page, when we first see the table, nothing is highlighted, but when we click a particular name, we are now getting that highlighted with the background color primary in Bootstrap, which is a darkish blue. And this will work for any number of teams that we click here in this table. What's happening here is that in our X data, we have all the teams available, but we also have an empty array called highlighted. And when a table row is clicked, what happens is the name of that team is pushed into that highlighted array. And then we bind the class attribute of the TD element. And if that particular team's name is in that array, we will then add the class of background primary. So it's very simple to add that kind of functionality when Alpine is in the mix. Now let's finish with another example. It's going to be something you don't want to do in your web applications. Let's go up to our X data here, and we're going to define another bit of state called rotated, and again that's going to be an empty array. And what we're going to do here is when we mouse over the city for a particular team, we're going to rotate the name of that city. So let's go back to our template, and we're going to target this TD for the team city. So the event that we're interested in here, it's the mouse over event. So we're going to use this syntax here, mouse over, and what we're going to do is we're going to take that rotated array and we're going to push the value of the team's name just as we did above for the name. And above we were binding the class of that TD element. What we're going to do is we're going to bind the style. Now in HTML, the style attribute allows you to add styles to a particular element in the DOM. What we do here is we check the rotated array to see if it includes this team's name. And if it does, what we're doing is we're transforming and rotating 180 degrees. So let's save this file and go back to our page now and refresh. If we toggle the table, when we click a particular row, we get the highlighting as before. But when we mouse over some of these cities, we can see that we're rotating the city name by 180 degrees. And what we can also do is add a mouse out event, and that event is fired when a mouse's cursor leaves a particular DOM element. And when we leave the element, we want to rotate it back to its original position. Let's see how we can add that now. If we go back to our TD element here, we can add another listener here, and it's going to be the mouse out event. And what we want to do when we mouse out, we want to reset the state for the rotated array, and we want to filter this team out of the array. So we're going to use the rotated.filter method, and for each element in the rotated array, we want to make sure that we keep all elements that are not equal to the current team's name. Let's see if that works. Let's go back to the page and we'll refresh this page. When we toggle the table and we mouse over a particular city, you can see that it's rotated 180 degrees. When we mouse out, you can see it goes back to its original position. And this will happen as we scroll through all of these elements in the table. We're rotating the particular element that our mouse is over, but when we leave that element with the mouse out event, the text goes back to its original position. And this shows you what you can do with Alpine. It's very easy to build these different kind of interactive functionalities, and we aren't delegating our entire front end to React or Vue.js in order to do it. And we can still use Django's built-in forms, authentication, and so on. So that's all for this video. It was mainly to demonstrate two different ways of working with Alpine. The first method allows you to build small bits of interactive functionality very easily, and it doesn't involve JSON serialization of any kind. The second method is a bit more complex, where you're serializing things to JSON and storing complex objects in your Alpine state, but it gives you some benefits where you can manage things on the client without necessarily giving up the benefits of using a Django application. So if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.